Before fear became a weapon, it was a warning signal. Before it hardened into doctrine, it functioned as a boundary, a subtle pressure alerting systems to instability. In the universe that would later produce Sinestro, order was not born from cruelty or ambition, but from a collective agreement that chaos, left unchecked, would eventually consume everything it touched. This belief was not radical. It was conservative in the deepest sense. Preservation over transformation, stability over risk, continuity over rupture. The cosmic stage was vast, but its logic was simple. Worlds revolved around predictable cycles. Power was distributed through structures that valued restraint. Guardians watched rather than intervened. Law was understood as a neutral force, impersonal and procedural, meant to regulate behavior without imposing identity. The Green Lantern Corps embodied this ethos. Willpower was framed as discipline, as the capacity to act without surrendering to impulse. Emotion existed, but it was subordinated. Passion was tolerated only insofar as it did not distort judgment. Within this architecture, fear had a place. It was acknowledged as an instinct, a primitive reaction to uncertainty. Yet it was meant to be overcome, mastered, rendered invisible. The ideal subject was the one who could experience fear without letting it shape decisions. Fear was something to rise above. To feel it too intensely was to risk corruption. To organize around it was unthinkable. This was the world before the fracture. A system convinced of its own neutrality. A moral order that believed it had transcended the darker currents of sentient behavior simply by refusing to name them. It was a world that trusted suppression as a form of wisdom, that assumed silence equaled control. Sinestro emerged from this world not as an anomaly, but as its most disciplined product. He was not a rebel in origin. He was exemplary. His authority was earned through consistency, not charisma, through enforcement, not persuasion. On his homeworld, order was fragile, constantly threatened by internal decay and external interference. Sinestro did not theorize chaos. He lived inside its consequences. He watched societies fracture not because they lacked ideals, but because they lacked the strength to impose them. Where others saw freedom as an inherent good, Sinestro saw it as a variable, something that needed containment. He observed that fear did not disappear when ignored. It migrated. It pooled beneath structures that refused to acknowledge it. It resurfaced as violence, as revolt, as mass hysteria. In his experience, chaos was not an abstract possibility. It was a recurring outcome. Authority, then, was not a moral failing. It was a responsibility. Someone had to bear the weight of decision. Someone had to absorb the fear others could not manage. Sinestro understood power not as domination, but as insulation. A wall between fragile societies and their own worst impulses. The Guardians did not reject this logic outright. They simply feared its implications. To accept fear as a governing force would require acknowledging that their system was incomplete, that willpower alone could not account for the complexity of sentient behavior, that order might require something more invasive than restraint. So the contradiction remained unresolved. Fear existed everywhere, shaping behavior, motivating obedience, triggering collapse. Yet it remained officially unacknowledged. A shadow cast by the very light meant to eliminate it. This was the latent tension embedded in the system. Not a clash of personalities, but of premises. On one side, a belief in self-regulation, in the moral maturation of subjects left free to choose correctly. On the other, a recognition that choice itself was unevenly distributed, that not all beings possessed the same capacity to resist panic, envy, or rage. Sinestro did not articulate this as philosophy. He enacted it as governance. On Corrigar, order was absolute. Crime was minimal. Dissent was rare. Fear was visible, named, and operational. It did not lurk in the shadows. It stood at the center, functioning as deterrence. The system worked, at least on the surface. From the perspective of the broader cosmic order, however, something felt off. The calm Sinestro produced carried a density, a pressure. It was stable but rigid. Peace was maintained not through trust, but through anticipation of consequence. The system did not collapse, but it did not breathe. This was the moment before crisis, before rings changed color, before alliances hardened into ideologies, before fear ceased to be a response and became a principle. The tragedy of Sinestro is not that he fell from grace. It is that grace was never equipped to deal with what he saw. The order he served depended on the assumption that chaos could be managed through denial, that the darker forces of sentience would dissolve if left unacknowledged. Sinestro's existence challenged that assumption simply by functioning too well. He was not wrong yet. He was effective. He was loyal. He was indispensable. And that was precisely the problem. Because systems that rely on unspoken contradictions always produce their own counterforces. When fear is excluded from the official structure of order, it does not disappear. It accumulates. It seeks form. It waits for someone willing to carry it openly. Sinestro did not invent tyranny. He refined it. He did not introduce fear into the universe. He organized it, and once fear is organized, it does not return quietly to the margins. Sinestro's origin does not begin with rebellion, but with fidelity. His psychology is rooted in alignment, not deviation. He internalized the values of order so thoroughly that he began to see their limits long before others noticed their cracks. Where most lanterns understood law as an abstract framework, Sinestro understood it as lived pressure. Law was not an idea hovering above society. It was a force that pressed down on unstable populations, shaping behavior through presence rather than persuasion. Corrigar was not a world predisposed to harmony. Its political landscape was fragmented, its social structures weak, its institutions easily undermined by opportunism and fear-driven unrest. Sinestro's rise was not the result of ambition alone, but of necessity. Authority filled a vacuum that idealism could not occupy. In this environment, moral hesitation was not a virtue. It was an invitation to collapse. The Green Lantern Corps offered Sinestro a tool that perfectly matched his disposition. Willpower, as defined by the Corps, was not emotional intensity but controlled resolve. It rewarded individuals capable of imposing order on themselves first. Sinestro excelled because his internal architecture was already rigid. He did not struggle with doubt. He struggled with others' inability to withstand it. This distinction matters. Sinestro's later transformation is often misread as corruption through power. In reality, it was power revealing an already present worldview. The ring did not change him. It amplified him. It allowed him to externalize a belief he already held, that most beings do not seek freedom, they seek relief from uncertainty. And relief, more often than not, arrives through submission to structure. Within the Corps, Sinestro functioned as an enforcer among diplomats. His methods were harsher, but his results were undeniable. Crime fell. Resistance faded. Stability increased. The Guardians tolerated his excesses because they aligned with outcomes the system quietly desired but publicly disavowed. Sinestro became the shadow arm of a luminous institution, performing acts others benefited from but did not wish to witness. This dynamic created a psychological asymmetry. Sinestro absorbed what the system refused to integrate. Fear, coercion, intimidation, these were treated as contaminants rather than components of governance. yet they were constantly outsourced to him. Over time, this produced not guilt, but clarity. Sinestro saw the hypocrisy before he felt resentment. He recognized that the moral order he served relied on denial to preserve its self-image. Hal Jordan, by contrast, emerged from a different psychic economy. His willpower was improvisational rather than architectural. He responded to crisis through adaptability, not control. Where Sinestro sought permanence, Hal embodied flux. Their rivalry was not personal at first. It was structural. Two responses to chaos occupying the same symbolic territory. Hal believed that fear was something to move through. Sinestro believed it was something to position against. One treated emotion as an obstacle to be transcended. The other treated it as a lever to be pulled. These positions were mutually exclusive, yet the core attempted to contain both within the same framework, as if contradiction could be neutralized through procedure. The breaking point was inevitable. Sinestro's governance on Corrigar crossed from enforcement into absolutism, not because his principles changed, but because their application became total. Fear was no longer a corrective force at the margins. It became the organizing center. Order no longer emerged from shared agreement, but from omnipresent consequence. The Guardians' response exposed the fragility of their moral posture. They condemned Sinestro not for his effectiveness, but for making visible what they preferred to keep implicit. His punishment was framed as ethical necessity, yet it functioned as symbolic purification. By expelling him, the core attempted to cleanse itself of the very mechanisms it continued to rely on elsewhere. This expulsion did not produce remorse. It produced reorientation. Sinestro did not experience exile as injustice. He experienced it as confirmation. The system had revealed its limits. It could not acknowledge fear without losing its narrative of moral superiority. If order required fear, then fear would need its own structure. The yellow light was not discovered by accident. It was sought. Sinestro recognized that willpower alone was insufficient to govern unstable systems. Will demanded internal cohesion. Fear required none. It operated regardless of belief, culture, or maturity. Fear equalized. It bypassed deliberation. It produced immediate compliance. By forging a core around fear, Sinestro did not abandon order. He radicalized it. He stripped it of its illusions and rebuilt it around what he considered an honest foundation. Control without pretense. Authority without apology. Stability enforced rather than requested. This was not a descent into madness. It was a crystallization of logic. Fear, once relegated to the shadows, now stood at the center, radiant and explicit. The universe did not change. The lens through which it was governed did. From this moment on, the conflict could no longer be managed through dialogue or reform. Two incompatible visions of order now existed, each exposing the other's blind spots. Neutrality collapsed. The system was forced to choose not between good and evil, but between concealment and revelation. And once fear is given a symbol, a structure, and an army, it stops being a reaction. It becomes a claim on reality itself. The emergence of the Sinestro core did not announce itself as a declaration of war. It unfolded as a reconfiguration of gravity. Power did not shift abruptly, it began to pull differently. Systems that once relied on negotiation, patience, and moral appeal now faced a force that operated through immediacy. Fear required no translation. It moved faster than ideology. It crossed borders without needing permission. Where willpower asked for alignment, fear imposed orientation. Sinestro understood that every structure governs through anticipation. Law does not function only through punishment, but through the expectation of it. By formalizing fear as a central organizing principle, he accelerated what governance already implied but rarely admitted. The yellow ring did not corrupt its bearer. It clarified intent. It removed the fiction that obedience emerges naturally from shared values. Obedience, Sinestro observed, emerges from asymmetry. The early actions of the Sinestro core reflected this clarity. Worlds stabilized almost immediately under its presence. Resistance collapsed not because it was defeated, but because it recalculated. Fear compressed decision-making. It shortened the distance between impulse and outcome. Populations adjusted behavior not out of loyalty, but out of survival instinct. From a purely functional perspective, the results were difficult to contest. This effectiveness forced a recalibration within the Green Lantern Corps. Their mandate had always rested on the assumption that willpower represented the highest form of agency. Yet here was a system producing faster compliance, broader reach, and fewer variables. The contrast was uncomfortable. Fear did not inspire heroes, but it produced order. It did not elevate individuals, but it neutralized threats. Hal Jordan encountered this reality not as theory, but as lived confrontation. His encounters with Sinestro were no longer framed as mentorship gone awry. They became encounters between incompatible temporalities. Hal acted in moments. Sinestro governed in spans. Hal trusted individuals to rise under pressure. Sinestro assumed most would collapse unless pressure was externally regulated. Their confrontations were less about domination than definition. Each engagement tested which vision of order could sustain itself under escalation. Hal relied on improvisation, moral intuition, and personal resolve. Sinestro relied on inevitability. He did not rush. He waited. Fear works best when it is anticipated rather than delivered. As the conflict intensified, the psychological architecture of each side became more pronounced. Green Lanterns began to question the limits of their mandate. They were trained to confront threats, not to manage populations. Their power was reactive by design. Sinestro's was preventative. He did not respond to chaos. He preempted it. This distinction altered the symbolic landscape of the universe. Conflict was no longer framed solely as hero versus villain. It became a dispute over the legitimacy of control itself. The question was no longer who had the right to act, but who had the right to decide before action became necessary. Sinestro positioned himself not as an antagonist to order, but as its custodian. He argued, implicitly through action rather than rhetoric, that freedom without capacity is cruelty, that offering choice to those unable to manage it produces suffering masquerading as liberty. In his framework, fear was not oppression. It was accommodation, a system adjusted to the psychological limits of its subjects. This logic exposed a vulnerability within the Green Lantern ideal. Willpower assumes an equal starting point. Fear exploits inequality. It does not care who deserves authority. It identifies who lacks resilience and governs accordingly. In this sense, the Sinestro Corps functioned less like an army and more like an infrastructure. It reorganized space itself, redefining which behaviors were viable. Resistance movements adapted, not by opposing fear directly, but by attempting to become invisible to it. This created a new kind of tension. Compliance became performative. Dissent went underground. Order appeared absolute, yet beneath it, pressure accumulated. Fear suppressed chaos, but it also compressed it. Sinestro was aware of this. He did not deny the cost. He accepted it. Every system, he believed, generates surplus. Suffering was not a failure of governance, but a byproduct to be managed. The alternative, in his view, was uncontrolled collapse. Between quiet oppression and violent disintegration, He chose the former without hesitation. The Green Lantern Corps could no longer treat Sinestro as an aberration. He was now a mirror. His existence forced them to confront the implications of their own methods. They too imposed order. They too wielded overwhelming power. The difference lay not in action, but in justification. As the universe adjusted to this duality, neutrality eroded. Worlds were forced to align, not ideologically, but psychologically. Under willpower, individuals were asked to rise. Under fear, they were required to submit. Both produced order. Both exacted cost. The conflict had moved beyond individuals. It had begun to restructure the moral terrain itself. And once order becomes a question of which pressure is more tolerable, the outcome is no longer determined by virtue, but by endurance. The stage was set for escalation. Fear had proven its efficiency. Willpower had revealed its fragility. The next phase would not test which system worked, but which could survive being pushed beyond its original design. Escalation did not arrive as a single catastrophic event. It arrived as saturation. Fear, once introduced as a corrective force, began to permeate every layer of interaction. Its presence altered not only behavior, but perception itself. Worlds under the influence of the Sinestro Corps did not merely comply, they recalibrated what they believed was possible. Choice narrowed. Risk became unthinkable. Stability was achieved through contraction. This was the point at which Sinestro's project revealed its deeper structure. Fear was no longer an instrument used selectively. It had become an environment, a constant atmospheric pressure shaping decisions before they reached consciousness. Governance no longer required visible enforcement. The anticipation of consequence did the work. The system governed itself. From Sinestro's perspective, this was not mission drift. It was maturation. Every functional order, he believed, moves toward invisibility. The most efficient control does not announce itself. It becomes indistinguishable from reality. When populations internalize fear as common sense, authority no longer needs to assert itself. It simply occupies the center. The Green Lantern Corps struggled to respond to this shift because their framework was built for confrontation, not diffusion. They could battle enforcers. They could dismantle strongholds. What they could not easily counter was an atmosphere. Fear did not need to win fights. It only needed to persist. Hal Jordan's role evolved under this pressure. He was no longer simply opposing Sinestro as a rival. He became a symbol of an alternative psychic economy. His presence signaled that fear was not inevitable. That uncertainty could be endured without submission. Yet this message carried diminishing returns in territories where fear had already reorganized daily life. Hope requires time. Fear compresses it. Every encounter between Hal and Sinestro reinforced this asymmetry. Hal acted to restore possibility. Sinestro acted to foreclose it. Hal appealed to potential futures. Sinestro enforced immediate consequences. One expanded the horizon. The other narrowed it until compliance felt like relief. As the conflict intensified, Sinestro's authority hardened into something closer to sovereignty. He no longer positioned himself as a corrective force operating alongside cosmic order. He declared that order itself required a new foundation. The Guardian's model, he concluded, was unstable because it relied on idealized subjects. His model relied on predictable responses. This shift marked a critical psychological turn. Sinestro no longer framed fear as a means to preserve order. He framed it as the only honest basis for it. In doing so, he crossed from enforcement into ideology. Fear was no longer situational. It became normative. The Yellow Corps reflected this transformation. Its members were not united by shared values, but by shared capacity to inspire terror. Recruitment was based on efficacy, not ethics. The core did not cultivate belief. It cultivated reputation. Power flowed not from internal discipline, but from the echo of fear projected outward. This created a feedback loop. The more fear circulated, the more authority consolidated. The more authority consolidated, the less resistance could manifest openly. Dissent did not disappear. It fragmented. It became isolated, private, and ultimately unsustainable. Fear thrives in isolation. It weakens solidarity by design. From the outside, Sinestro's domains appeared calm. Violence decreased. Revolts were rare. Yet beneath the surface, psychological erosion was constant. Subjects learned to self-censor. Communities avoided collective action. Creativity contracted. Order was preserved, but vitality drained away. Sinestro accepted this as a necessary trade. In his calculus, vitality without stability was meaningless. Better a static peace than a dynamic collapse. Better obedience than chaos. This logic was not cruel in intent. It was protective in orientation. He did not seek suffering. He sought predictability. The Green Lantern Corps, however, could not reconcile this outcome with their foundational narrative. They were forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. Willpower functioned best under conditions of relative stability. It was aspirational. Fear functioned under any condition. It was adaptive. This realization destabilized the core internally. Lanterns began to question whether their power was sufficient for the universe they faced. Some resented Sinestro not because he was wrong, but because he articulated a truth they could not publicly accept. That order often depends less on virtue than on leverage. Sinestro exploited this hesitation. He did not need to defeat the core outright. He needed only to outlast their certainty. Every delayed response, every internal debate, every moral hesitation reinforced his claim that fear provided clarity where willpower produced doubt. The conflict had now reached a stage where escalation no longer meant larger battles. It meant deeper entrenchment. Fear and willpower were no longer competing tactics. They were competing interpretations of sentient nature. One assumed growth was possible if individuals were challenged. The other assumed collapse was inevitable unless individuals were constrained. Between these assumptions, there was no compromise. By organizing fear into a stable structure, Sinestro had transformed it from an emotion into a worldview. He did not merely govern through fear. He taught the universe to expect it. An expectation, once internalized, is far more durable than force. The question was no longer whether fear worked. It clearly did. The question that loomed, unspoken but unavoidable, was what kind of universe would remain once fear no longer needed to announce itself at all. The answer would not arrive through debate. It would emerge through consequence. The final transformation did not come through victory or defeat, but through saturation reaching its limit. Fear, once efficient because it was external, began to lose clarity as it became internalized everywhere. When pressure is constant, it stops functioning as a signal and starts functioning as background. At this stage, Sinestro's system faced a paradox of its own making. Control had succeeded so thoroughly that it began to erode the very responsiveness it depended on. Populations governed by fear no longer reacted sharply. They adapted. They learned the contours of punishment and navigated within them. Compliance became procedural. Obedience became hollow. The system achieved order, but lost engagement. Authority remained intact, yet increasingly brittle. When everything is forbidden, transgression loses meaning. When consequence is omnipresent, it stops motivating and starts numbing. Sinestro understood this risk intellectually, but not emotionally. His orientation toward order was architectural rather than relational. He thought in structures, not in lived experience. From his perspective, numbness was preferable to volatility. A quiet population was safer than a passionate one. He did not see erosion as collapse. He saw it as stabilization reaching equilibrium. This is where the conflict reached its most revealing stage. The Green Lantern Corps could not defeat fear by overpowering it. Every direct confrontation only reinforced its legitimacy. Fear thrives on visibility. It feeds on reaction. What destabilized Sinestro's system was not resistance, but refusal to be shaped entirely by anticipation. Hal Jordan's interventions shifted subtly. Rather than confronting fear head-on, he began operating at its margins. He restored pockets of unpredictability, small disruptions, moments where outcome was not immediately legible. These actions did not dismantle fear as a system, but they exposed its dependency on total coherence. Fear requires a closed circuit. Once gaps appear, its authority weakens. Sinestro perceived these gaps as threats not because they produced chaos, but because they reintroduced uncertainty. Uncertainty was the one variable his system could not metabolize. It was precisely what fear had been designed to eliminate. In attempting to govern everything, Sinestro had removed his own capacity to adapt. The rivalry between Sinestro and Hal reached a new register here. It was no longer about whose power was stronger. It was about which orientation could survive entropy. Hal's approach tolerated instability. Sinestro's did not. One allowed for failure. The other treated failure as unacceptable. As pressure accumulated, Sinestro responded by intensifying enforcement. Fear, once ambient, became demonstrative again. Public punishments, symbolic acts, displays meant to remind populations of consequence. Yet these gestures revealed weakness rather than strength. They signaled that fear was no longer self-sustaining. It needed spectacle to remain credible. Spectacle always carries risk. It invites interpretation. It draws attention. The more Sinestro relied on visibility, the more he reintroduced the very volatility he sought to erase. Fear ceased to be background and returned to the foreground, where it could be contested. This marked the subtle collapse of inevitability. Not the collapse of power, but of its narrative. Fear could no longer present itself as natural law. It had to assert itself. An assertion always implies the possibility of refusal. The Green Lantern Corps did not suddenly regain moral clarity. Their system remained flawed, aspirational, uneven. But it possessed one advantage Sinestro's no longer did. It could absorb contradiction. Willpower did not require uniform response. It tolerated difference. Fear demanded alignment. Sinestro's tragedy crystallized here. He had built an empire capable of suppressing chaos, but incapable of evolving. By freezing behavior, he froze possibility. By eliminating risk, he eliminated growth. Order persisted, but meaning thinned. What remained was structure without vitality, authority without loyalty, peace without participation. Sinestro did not interpret this as failure. He interpreted it as proof that sentient beings could not be trusted with openness. Their numbness confirmed his suspicion. Without pressure, they drift. Without consequence, they decay. He doubled down not out of madness, but out of coherence. Retreat would invalidate the entire architecture. The conflict reached stalemate not because fear was defeated, but because it revealed its ceiling. It could dominate space, but not time. It could impose behavior, but not sustain identification. It could silence chaos, but not replace it with something enduring. In this stage, the universe did not choose between fear and willpower. It learned the cost of each. Fear delivered order quickly and extracted it slowly. Willpower struggled to establish stability, but preserved the conditions for renewal. The battle lines remained, but their meaning shifted. Sinestro was no longer merely an antagonist. He became a cautionary structure, a demonstration of what happens when the fear of chaos becomes more powerful than chaos itself. The system had not collapsed. It had calcified, and calcified systems do not break loudly. They endure until something small, unpredictable, and ungovernable moves through the cracks. At this stage, the conflict no longer belonged to Sinestro or the Green Lantern Corps alone. It had escaped the boundaries of character and plot and settled into the symbolic infrastructure of the universe itself. Fear and willpower ceased to function as individual traits or tactical resources. They became cultural grammars, ways of interpreting reality, ways of organizing collective life. Sinestro's greatest impact was not the territory he controlled, but the question he made unavoidable. What sustains order when ideals fail? The presence of the Sinestro Corps forced every system to confront a truth it preferred to keep abstract. Stability is not maintained by belief alone. It is enforced by consequence, anticipation, and asymmetry of power. The discomfort this produced was not moral, but existential. If fear works, then the narrative of enlightened governance becomes fragile. Within the fictional universe, this realization reshaped political imagination. Neutral worlds could no longer pretend that cosmic order was benevolent by default. Every structure began to reveal its coercive underside. Even the Green Lantern Corps, long framed as impartial guardians, appeared differently once fear was openly weaponized elsewhere. Their authority, too, rested on overwhelming force. Their restraint now looked less like virtue and more like preference. This reframing altered identification patterns among audiences as well. Sinestro became more than a villain. He became legible. His logic resonated because it mirrored real historical and cultural tensions. Societies that experience instability often trade openness for security. Populations under threat rarely demand freedom. They demand protection. Sinestro articulated this demand without sentimentality. He did not flatter. He imposed. As a symbolic figure, Sinestro occupies the space of the tyrant who does not lie about his methods. He does not promise liberation. He promises order. His honesty is unsettling because it removes moral comfort. He does not disguise control as care. He presents it as necessity. This clarity is what makes him compelling. It exposes the transactional nature of authority that idealistic narratives attempt to obscure. The Yellow Corps itself functions as a visual and conceptual inversion of heroism. Its members are not united by aspiration, but by capacity to dominate perception. Fear becomes spectacle. Identity becomes projection. Power is measured not by internal discipline, but by the magnitude of reaction produced in others. This inversion resonates in a media-saturated culture, where visibility often substitutes for legitimacy and attention amplifies authority, regardless of ethical grounding. Fear, in this context, mirrors how modern systems operate beyond fiction. It circulates faster than deliberation. It bypasses reason. It collapses nuance. The Sinestro Corps embodies this acceleration. Their power does not require consensus. It requires saturation. Once fear is everywhere, resistance fragments. Collective response dissolves into individual survival strategies. The Green Lantern Corps, by contrast, reflects a slower model of cohesion. Willpower requires cultivation. It assumes time, education, and shared symbolic meaning. In a universe increasingly shaped by immediacy, this model appears vulnerable. The cultural tension between these forces echoes contemporary anxieties about governance, security, and the erosion of trust. Sinestro's impact lies in how he reframes fear from a moral failure into a functional resource. This reframing unsettles audiences because it aligns with lived experience. Fear already governs behavior in subtle ways. Sinestro merely removes the disguise. By doing so, he destabilizes the boundary between heroism and control, between protection and domination. Symbolically, the conflict operates as a study in polarization. Not political polarization in a narrow sense, but psychological polarization. The splitting of reality into tolerable and intolerable zones. Fear simplifies complexity by reducing options. Willpower preserves complexity, but struggles to act decisively within it. Both positions attract allegiance because both address different aspects of human limitation. The cultural aftershock of Sinestro's rise is a loss of innocence. The universe cannot return to believing that order emerges naturally from goodwill. The idea of neutral guardianship is permanently compromised. Every institution must now confront its own shadow, the mechanisms it uses to maintain stability, the fears it suppresses or exploits. This is why Sinestro endures as a mythic figure. He does not represent chaos. He represents the fear of it becoming unmanageable. He embodies the moment when preservation eclipses growth, when stability is valued more than vitality, when control becomes preferable to uncertainty. The conflict reshapes how audiences understand power, not as a binary of good and evil, but as a spectrum of pressures applied to fragile systems. Sinestro forces recognition of a disturbing possibility, that tyranny is not born from cruelty alone, but from the terror of collapse, from the belief that chaos, once unleashed, cannot be recovered from. In this sense, the Sinestro narrative functions as a cultural diagnostic. It reveals how easily protection becomes oppression when fear sets the terms, how quickly order hardens into doctrine when uncertainty is framed as existential threat, how readily societies accept constraint when instability feels imminent. The symbolic weight of this conflict does not resolve. It lingers. It reshapes interpretation long after specific story arcs conclude. Fear, once seen as something to overcome, becomes something to interrogate. Not because it is evil, but because it is effective. And anything effective enough to replace ideals will eventually demand a throne of its own. The aftermath of Sinestro's rise does not resemble defeat. It resembles sediment. Layers of consequence settle into the universe's structure, altering its foundation without announcing a conclusion. Fear does not retreat. It changes position. It withdraws from spectacle and returns to latency, now recognized, now remembered. What cannot be unseen cannot be unlearned. Sinestro's legacy is not the territory he ruled, but the precedent he established. He proved that order does not require moral consensus to function. It requires leverage. This realization lingers within every institution that follows. Guardians may reaffirm restraint. Lanterns may renew vows. Yet beneath these gestures lies a permanent awareness that fear can organize reality faster than ideals ever will. The Green Lantern Corps survives, but altered. Its authority now carries an echo. Willpower no longer appears as a natural solution. It appears as a choice, a commitment made in full knowledge of alternatives. This awareness strengthens some lanterns and fractures others. To wield willpower after Sinestro is to do so without innocence. The light remains, but it casts a longer shadow. Sinestro himself does not fade into irrelevance. He becomes a fixed reference point, a structural memory embedded in the universe's moral architecture. Every act of enforcement is measured against his example. Every compromise with fear risks resemblance. He no longer needs to rule to exert influence. His logic persists independently of his presence. This is the mark of true symbolic permanence. The tyrant outlives the throne. Sinestro becomes less a character and more a question. How much fear is acceptable in the pursuit of stability? At what point does protection collapse into domination? Where does order end and paralysis begin? His personal tragedy is not isolation or exile. It is coherence without flexibility. Sinestro never betrays his principles. He exhausts them. He follows them to their terminal conclusion and finds that order, when stripped of contradiction, cannot regenerate. It can only endure. Endurance without renewal becomes decay by other means. The universe absorbs this lesson unevenly. Some systems lean further into control, citing Sinestro as proof that fear works. Others recoil, doubling down on openness despite risk. Polarization deepens, not because the conflict continues, but because it has clarified what is at stake. The tension between safety and growth no longer hides behind abstraction. Sinestro's myth endures because it mirrors a recurring pattern in collective life. Moments of instability produce figures willing to carry fear openly. They do not invent anxiety. They consolidate it. They promise relief, not transformation. Their appeal lies in certainty offered at the cost of possibility. In this sense, Sinestro does not represent evil. He represents a choice made under pressure, a choice to freeze the world rather than risk its fracture. This is why he remains unsettling. His logic is not alien. It is familiar. It surfaces whenever chaos feels imminent and patience feels irresponsible. The aftermath, then, is not resolution but vigilance. The universe does not move past Sinestro. It moves with him in mind. Fear remains available. Order remains contested. Willpower remains fragile. None achieves final victory. They coexist in uneasy equilibrium. What remains most enduring is the clarity. Sinestro reveals that tyranny is rarely born from hatred. It is born from the terror of losing control, from the conviction that collapse is worse than oppression, from the belief that humans and worlds cannot be trusted with openness. This belief does not disappear. It waits, and every time uncertainty rises, every time systems strain under the weight of unpredictability, Sinestro's shadow lengthens again. Not as a call to arms, but as a reminder that fear, once invited to govern, never truly leaves. It only changes form. The conflict does not end. It stabilizes.